Section 7 of the Western Boundary, and other essays by Helmuth von Moltke, translated by Charles Flint McClumpher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Holland and Belgium in their mutual relations from their separation under Philip II till their reunion under William I. Part 2. The experiment which the Spanish had twice so successfully tried against Antwerp, the French likewise, 1583, desired to accomplish for their own advantage. The Duke of Anjou, whom the Netherlanders had selected as a new sovereign for themselves, and from whom they hoped better treatment than from their Spanish masters, this duke found himself embarrassed by the conditions to which he had taken oath at the beginning. Therefore, under plausible pretexts, he assembled a few thousand Frenchmen at Burgerhout, not far from the city, and under the pretence of a review, marched with a numerous retinue to the Kipdorf gate. One of the attendants of the Duke halted on the bridge, as if he had injured his leg. "Jean Rompu" was repeated by many voices. Immediately the French charged, killed the guard, took possession of the gate and the walls, and penetrated into the city. Several days before this, a slight rumour of the Duke's intention had been circulated in the city. "A gate may be easily conquered this way," cried out a voice from the crowd, when the Duke rode out of the city, and it was noticed that the courtiers wore armour under their jackets. Footnote. The German reads "Solicit sic volantor urban." Thor means both gate and full, hence the play upon the expression cannot be Englished. End footnote. Now the citizens rushed by one, the streets were closed with chains, stones were hurled down from the houses upon the heads of those who had entered. The number of armed Antwerpers grew and grew, for they, schooled by terrible experiences, prefer to die rather than willingly suffer pillage again, or, in truth, a St. Bartholomew's Eve. Soon the French were in the most frightful distress. The cannon from the wall thundered down upon them, terror and confusion seized them, and even their own troops, which had continued to march in through the gate they had taken, hindered them from retreating. After losing 2,000 men, the Duke of Anjou was obliged to relinquish the attempt to extend his own power, and the residents of Antwerp celebrated their rescue by their own valour. Alexander of Parma gave the city the last blow during the siege, or rather during the blockade, in the year 1584 to 1585. The attempt of the Duke to besiege a place of 80,000 inhabitants with 10,000 men, separated as they necessarily were by a stream 1,200 feet wide and without bridges, men moreover dissatisfied and no longer to be depended upon, and this too at a time when Ghent, Bruges, Dendermonde, Mechlin, and Brussels were not yet subdued, and the fleet of Zeeland was cruising in the Schelde without its being possible to produce one ship in opposition to it. Such an attempt, even in combination with the enormous activity and endurance of the Spaniards and their general, could succeed only because of the weakness of the defence. The circumstances, however, of this remarkable siege are too well known to receive here more than passing notice. After Antwerp again passed under Spanish rule, the rest of the trade of the Netherlands fled over to Holland, and Amsterdam became the centre of the commerce of the world. In addition to the increase in wealth which the Hollanders received from the southern provinces, the commerce of Holland increased at an unparalleled rate in consequence of a decree of the Cabinet of Madrid, the object of which was to annihilate the very existence of this commerce. Philip II had long ago forbidden his subjects to have intercourse with the rebellious Netherlands, but this trade continued, under the observance of certain forms and feigned names, to be of immeasurable advantage to both parties. Finally, Philip III put those prohibitive laws into execution, and thereby forced the enterprising commercial spirit of the Hollanders to seek at the very fountainhead the products of the East Indies which Holland had previously gone to the Spanish markets to procure. Therefore the Hollanders were able to deliver these to northern Europe at vastly greater profit. In the year 1497, the Portuguese Vasco da Gama had discovered the way to the East Indies around the Cape of Good Hope, and in this way caused the ruin of Genoa and Venice. 20 years later, another Portuguese, Magellan, discovered the southwestern passage about the south point of America. The Hollanders now wished to discover the supposed northeastern way for themselves and to use it, thus shortening the whole journey by a half. An unsuccessful attempt of the English did not scare them away. 3 small expeditions were equipped for this purpose, and the undaunted Heemskerk penetrated as far as 80 degrees of north latitude. When these new Argonauts, who had passed a frightful winter in that sea, hitherto unseen by the eye of man, had indeed proved the probability of a passage around the north of Asia, they at the same time were thoroughly convinced that this passage was impracticable for commercial purposes. The Hollanders now determined, in spite of all enemies, to trade by the same course as the Portuguese, who were then a part of Spain. 9 merchants of Amsterdam fitted out 4 ships for this purpose. This was the beginning of that famous East India Company, which, a few years after its formation, held command over fleets and armies, subjugated kingdoms, and held sway over boundless territory. Certainly such successes were only possible because of the decided preeminence of the Hollanders on the sea, but even this is one of the most remarkable events of that era, so rich in extraordinary things. Need and despair had transformed fishermen and seamen into pirates, their boats into privateers, and these privateers a few years later were metamorphosed in turn into a navy which attacked the Spanish flag on the high seas, destroyed their proud galleons, and even burned them in the Spanish ports, in which they were seeking safety in vain. The name of the Beggars' League was uttered with terror, and the conqueror of the Ottoman fleet in the harbour of Lepanto, from the banks of the Schelde, witnessed the destruction of his ships by the squadrons of Zeeland. The Armada, an undertaking the like of which had never been seen until Napoleon's equipment in the harbour of Bologna, perished by no means merely by the fury of the elements, but chiefly through the opposition of the Batavian English fleet. And even in the waters of the other hemisphere, the ancient celebrated flag of Spain had to yield to the youthful mercantile sea power. If justice requires it to be said that an unprecedented obstinate fatality pursued the undertakings of Spain upon the sea, on the other hand one must grant that no other navy, not excepting the English, has ever been able to exhibit such a rapid and brilliant development, and such a multitude of great military achievements with so few resources as did Holland at that period. Holland, a daughter of the sea, was invincible so long as that element could not be wrested from her. It was her origin, the condition of her continuance, her protection, her plague, and her supporter. Among other circumstances, the siege of Ostend proves how truly this was the case. It held at bay the weapons of the whole Spanish army, even under the command of a Spinola beneath its walls, for 3 years and 3 months. What an inestimable advantage for the young and feeble state! Though the results of the siege of Ostend are less important than those of Antwerp, yet the operation of the siege on both sides offers a far grander and more interesting theme, and when one considers the progress in methods of attack and destruction, its fame justly joins that of Troy and Tyre. One important fact was that the Spaniards, in spite of their gigantic efforts to cut off communication by sea, did not succeed, so that there reigned not only an abundance of provisions in the stronghold, but also the entire garrison of the same was able gradually to be discharged. Even for the first 20 months this siege cost the Spaniards several millions of money and 18,000 men. 250,000 shots were fired from 20 and 50-pound cannon against the city, which in turn lost 8,000 men and replied with 100,000 shots. Finally, Spinola, with the sacrifices which cost another 19 months, secured possession of a stone heap whose defenders and occupants had saved themselves in a new home across the sea, and he at the same time lost Sluis, a place of at least just as much importance as the one that had been obtained with such painful offerings. With the loss of the sovereignty of the sea, the United Provinces of the Netherlands were also lost to Spain, and after a war of more than 40 years, it now required the labour of 3 years in order to procure not peace, but only a truce of 12 years, which in the meantime was interrupted to continue the struggle for life and death, despite the complete prostration and impotency of Spain. But now how different was the civil state of the Spanish and the United Netherlands. The provinces that had voluntarily or by force returned under the Spanish rule presented a horrible picture of such misery as arbitrary and bad laws, revolution and war can spread over a country. Agriculture was completely abandoned, there being lack of workmen on account of the emigration, and no one was certain whether he should reap that which he had sown. This resulted in a terrible scarcity of grain, and this caused new emigrations. Business was depressed after so many heavy blows. On the fall of Antwerp it veered almost wholly toward the north, where it dared hope to find protection, and the privateers of Holland, which swarmed about all the estuaries of the Netherlands, completely destroyed the little that was left. Of course, all the factories and manufactures stopped, since the demand for their products had wholly ceased, unless, perhaps, one might reckon the Spanish soldiers as customers. Thus the boroughs and villages were empty, the cities, ravaged with pestilences and deserted by Protestant inhabitants whom Spanish intolerance had expelled, were like open graves, and packs of wolves roved over the waste fields once so blooming. A glance at the newly established state of the United Provinces reveals a very different sight, indeed the very opposite of this sad picture. Its population increased for the same reason, and in the same proportion, as that of the Spanish Netherlands melted away. The emigrations which impoverished the latter enriched the former, and the business which perished in Antwerp flourished in Amsterdam under the protection of the victorious fleet. Credit was strengthened by sensible laws, and still more so because these were enacted. In a word, the United Provinces, in the midst of a war, in which it was a question of their existence, enjoyed all the blessings of peace, all the prosperity of commerce, and in the midst of the storms which were raging about them, they established their sovereignty over another part of the world. In this way, the political, religious, and mercantile interests of one part of the Netherlands were separated from the other and became decidedly opposed to them. The lamentable contrast of the civil condition in the Spanish provinces with that of the favoured people in the north must have aroused the jealousy of the former, and this jealousy passed only too soon into hate, which 2 centuries have not been able to wipe out. From this period, the destinies of both parts really travel 2 distinct paths. The history of the Spanish Netherlands is miserable, their political life almost extinguished, and they themselves are only a battlefield in which other powers fight out their deadly feuds. The reason for this was both the political position of the provinces and the great number of fortresses which they had, to their own destruction, planted, and which did not aid them but Holland only. These were the bulwarks on which the great and numerous armies must first break their force before they could reach Holland, which, itself without forts since the siege of Leyden, Alkmaar, and Haarlem, has not been trodden by enemy's foot for centuries. Therefore, indeed, there is scarcely a spot on the whole earth on which so much blood has been shed for 2 consecutive centuries, and which has been so devastated by war, pillage, fire, and pestilence, by physical and moral oppression, as this unhappy country. Too weak to defend itself against its powerful neighbours, its foreign rulers have lacked power to protect it. Futile, therefore, were all attempts to renew its trade, that chief source of its prosperity. With extraordinary rapidity, an East India Company flourished immediately after its establishment at Ostend, but the rivalry of England and of the States forced it to dissolve again, and thus all other attempts have been of no avail. At that time statesmen considered these provinces, formerly so rich and prosperous, with a population equal to that of kingdoms such as Denmark, Sweden, and Portugal, only as a make-weight which, if laid upon this or that scale, would be inclined to preserve the equilibrium of the states. It is true that the Flemish had the intention of shaking off the Spanish rule, which was now so powerless, and of constituting themselves a free state, under the protection of France and the States. Negotiations were also begun between Louis XIV and the state pensioner De Witt, who proposed to take this opportunity to divide the rest of the Spanish Netherlands between themselves. But they were broken off, and the project was discontinued principally because each wished to have much, and all proposed to give little. In the year 1691, the Spanish crown offered the Netherland provinces to the States as theirs by right and inheritance, because the Spanish did not think that they could defend them against Louis XIV. But William III, then stadholder, declined the possession of these countries, chiefly because he foresaw in the religious differences an unconquerable hindrance to assimilation. So the Netherland provinces passed from the Spanish government into that of Austria, without having even bettered their destiny by that move, and thus we behold Belgium in its depths of impotency, while we see Holland mount the very summit of its power. The influence exerted by the United Netherlands upon the affairs of Europe since the 12 Years' Truce is very pronounced. After the expiration of the armistice, during which, however, the war in India was waging, war was again kindled between Spain and the States, but at that time the weakness of Spain was such that even Spinola was no longer able to arouse energy in the course of proceedings against the revolted countries. The military equipments of the States were also very slight, and in the year 1628, moreover, the Prince of Orange did not once enter the field. However, it was in the year 1648 that Spain first consented to acknowledge the States as sovereign countries in the Peace of Munster, Westphalia, which was a document written on mere paper, despite the value which the States placed upon the event, not on pergament, and only signed with Yoel Rey, I the King. This struggle had lasted altogether now 80 years. Whole generations had been born and died without having any knowledge of peace, in their own country at least, except by hearsay. And yet the desire for this peace was so feeble that the conclusion of the same on Holland's part met with great opposition. We have shown how during the war trade and industry had been elevated to the highest pinnacle. Moreover, art and science also were flourishing. The universities of Leyden, Franeker, Utrecht and Harderwijk were founded, and the masterpieces of the Netherlands School, which still form so essential a part of the wealth of the picture galleries of Europe, are offsprings of that stormy period and the one succeeding. To be sure, the state was in debt, but individuals enjoyed immeasurable prosperity and luxury. For example, in the case of the flower trade, a most decided contrast to the mercantile solidity of the Hollanders. They sold and bought such perishable wares as the bulbs of tulips and hyacinths at 5,000 or 6,000 florins a pound. If war had not become a necessity to the Hollanders, it was, however, a custom. They waged it, of course, with their own money, but with foreign blood, on foreign seas, and in foreign lands. But peace lasted only 4 years when the Netherland navy set sail against England, Portugal, and Sweden. England at that very moment preparing itself for the part which it intended to play in the monarchy of the seas, did not mistake the dangerous rival which it had in the young state across the Channel. England was already a formidable maritime power. The United Provinces would become such in the contest which was destined to preclude them from it. But in spite of the superiority which the number and greater size of their ships secured to the English, they were unable, by 2 military invasions, to vanquish the power of the provinces on the sea. Under commanders like Vosnay, Ruyter, and Tromp, this power kept its place everywhere, was just as oft conqueror as conquered, and it even dared at the close of this war to pass up the Thames as far as Chatham, where it partly captured and partly burned the royal ships lying there. At this crisis in London, they did not know how to protect themselves from the visit of the Netherlanders, unless by sinking their ships in the Thames. But while the navy of the States was playing such a glorious part, their land forces had fallen into such a decline that the Bishop of Munster was emboldened to invade them with an army, and while they were threatening the Queen of the Sea in her capital, they were forced to call upon France for aid against the ecclesiastical lord. This total ruin of the land force was partly wrought on purpose, and the reason for it is to be found in the jealousy which the magistrates had of the Prince of Orange. That is to say, this family had scarcely won for the country its independence before the country began to fear lest it should lose this through the family. With a kind of distrust which evinced little of the gratitude owed by the States to William the Silent and his family, the most of its members, having sacrificed their own lives in battle for the sake of these very States, they carefully excluded the descendants of the family from all posts and influence. The opposition to the House of Orange was represented by 2 distinguished men, namely Oldenbarnevelt, the pensioner of the Council of Holland, and his successor, De Witt. Both regarded it as very hazardous to give the warlike descendant of William I any power in governmental affairs. They found it advisable to keep the supreme power in various degrees of modification for the States General, that is, the deputies of the provinces, but chiefly for themselves as representatives of the province, which was by far the most powerful. The influential body of merchants especially agreed with them as regards this, for they, mindful of instances like those of all the reigns from the time of Charles of Burgundy to that of Anjou and Leicester, certainly had no cause to wish again for the government of a single man. A few violent measures of Prince Maurice and William II had still further injured the cause. A project of the latter respecting Amsterdam had miscarried, and William III, during his minority, lost all that distinguished him from a private citizen. The attitude of opposition of the House of Orange to the people of the Netherlands was an extraordinary one, and in order not to spoil everything, there was need of great moderation and circumspection, which signally distinguished the acts of the princes of this house. Their claims for a higher position were never established by a convention or a resolution. They rested merely on the great service rendered the state, and were therefore only the more honoured. Since the Union of Utrecht, each of the United Provinces formed a perfectly independent sovereign state in itself, whose regents were the deputies chosen from the whole body of the nobility and the cities and appointed States General. For general affairs of all the provinces, such as war and peace, taxation, treaties, etc., there was a committee of the states, the members of which were called the States General, and these were very much inclined, although unjustly, to regard themselves as the supreme power. Besides this actually highest power, there was wont to be, moreover, a seeming one, that is, the office of the stadtholder, although there was no longer a foreign regent that he had to represent. But the stadtholder outwardly represented the state, and through the lustre of his ancestry and his own person it was intended that he should inspire esteem in foreign powers. Generally, beside regency over several provinces, he united also in time of war the offices of general and admiral, because it was found that by the centralization of the powers it was possible to act with more strength, and at that time his influence, indeed, was very considerable. Now, at the very moment the high magistrates excluded the Orange family from these offices, and to a certain extent had even abolished these offices, there existed a strong and widespread feeling in their favour. For them were the remembrance of the distinguished services and a vast following among the people. Certainly a prince fond of war must have been more congenial to the nobility, although they felt they were very much in the background, than the corps of high mightinesses, and furthermore the common man, accustomed to his earls and custodians from bygone and happier days, loved the brilliancy and pomp of a liberal princely lord, who distributed honours and favours, while the states issued the writs only for taxes and duties. The Orange party, for reasons conceivable, had a following also in the army, so far as there was such a thing. Since ties of relationship bound the interests of the House of Orange to the royal family of England, De Witt threw his whole influence upon the interests of France. For this reason, the naval force had to be elevated to an imposing position, but the land force to be diminished as much as possible. In this policy, the mercantile frugality of the states seconded him. The appointments of officers in the troops, still remaining after a series of reductions, were possessed by the cousins of the burgomaster, and their whole duty was to spend their incomes and be anti-Orange. But the Allied States were of themselves about to undergo an experience, with less pain to themselves which they could have acquired from the example of others in history, namely, how dangerous is a division of the controlling power in the state, especially at a time when powerful neighbours are ready to enrich themselves through the weakness of others. Such a restless neighbour had the states par excellence in Louis XIV. This monarch believed that he had certain claims on the Spanish Netherlands. To ease his conscience, he ordered his council and some of his clergy to investigate these claims, and both found that they were well established. Moreover, Europe's criticism respecting these was that they could be better confirmed by canon than on legal grounds, and the king also determined to lend them the necessary strength by the help of a considerable army. De Witt purposely shut his eyes to that which certainly was easy to see, but which was destined to carry with it the overthrow of himself and his regime. He stoutly opposed every advancement of the Prince of Orange, and he reduced the army still further, and he regarded himself and the state, moreover, fully assured of the friendship of France, when the storm did burst forth, which all men conjectured must end the existence of the United Netherlands. France and England, then the two greatest powers in Europe, declared war with the States. Sweden and the Bishop of Munster and the Crown Prince of Cologne joined in this with a great force, and the Netherlands, hard-pressed, abandoned by their allies, and overwhelmed with warfare, had no other hopes than in their own strength, and in the possible aid of remote Spain and Brandenburg. The States made the most humble remonstrances, but in vain. Their humility was so great that England was almost constrained to find an excuse for withdrawal. Their future conquests were meanwhile distributed beforehand. An army of 150,000 men, and at that time men were not accustomed to such armies, under generals like Turenne and Conde, with the King of France at its head, advanced along the sea. 1672. Elderland, Utrecht, and Overijssel were immediately lost. Friesland and Groningen were in the possession of the enemy, and the floods alone hindered the French from advancing into Holland. The fortresses fell, one after another, even the strongest almost without resistance. Ostend, for example, was surrendered to the king in just as many days as it had years withstood Spinola. Louis XIV saw himself in the brilliant light of a great conqueror, and selected the right moment to return to Madame de Montespan. During the time of this unparalleled success, a formidable English fleet sailed up on the opposite side, intending to land and conquer the last spot in Holland where the independence of the States had fled for refuge. And the States had nothing to oppose to all these threatening storms, but 20,000 bad, undisciplined men, under commanders who had neither courage nor knowledge of war. And besides, there were quarrels, as usual, in the interior, and divided opinions with regard to the measures to be adopted. It actually required all the power of Louis XIV, and a miracle to prevent the annihilation of the state. A double ebb, which lasted 12 hours, and a hurricane immediately following it, prevented the landing. This incident was very rare in spring and autumn, but had never happened, as on this occasion in summer. Finally, those on land had to thank the presumption of Louis XIV, for what otherwise they had expected to thank his generosity. The excess of his demands drove the despairing people back to their own strength, and from this they were obliged now to expect their own rescue. De Witt and his party perished in the press of these circumstances. This distinguished man, who in addition to a decided passion for power, possessed all the qualities of a great statesman, together with his brother, the meritorious Admiral de Witt, was murdered by the mob in a shocking manner. Previous to this, the Prince of Orange had been appointed by general acclamation as Stadtholder and Captain General, and these officers were to be henceforth hereditary. Although many conditions had been stipulated on the part of France favourable to the Prince in the proposals for peace, yet he declared, when interrogated, that the proposals were in every respect unacceptable, and that one would rather perish than agree to them. The army was made up anew and organised, and if William III was not successful in his undertakings with this new army, great honour is due to him for having warded off a disgraceful peace by his firmness, just as he it was also who later, as King of England, again destroyed, at least partially, the threatening increase of France's supremacy. The relations continued to shape themselves without much action on the part of the States, more and more favourably, especially because of the presence of the imperial troops. And thus the Netherlands emerged from a conflict in which the greatest victory was the preservation of their existence. The Peace of Nijmegen, 1679, restored the state of the United Netherlands. From this time on, this state waged no more wars with England. Both countries naturally united against the threatening supremacy of France, And just as William III's ancestor 100 years before had broken the ascendancy of Spain, so William III of Orange seemed now destined to check the devastating torrent of French tyranny. Therefore, the Netherlands soon saw themselves involved in new wars. The first lasted 7 years, and, according to the Peace of Ryswick, the states continued in possession of all that they had before. But the war cost them 600 million florins. The second lasted 11 years. It was the celebrated War of Spanish Succession. William III died without seeing the favourable issue which the united armies of Marlborough and Eugene won by fighting. This war achieved its purpose on the whole, so far as the humiliation of Louis XIV was concerned, and it would have achieved much more had not a quarrel over a woman at the English court overthrown Marlborough in spite of his battles, and had they been as skilful in concluding peace as in carrying on war. According to the Peace of Utrecht, the Spanish Netherlands, 1715, passed into the possession of Austria, and the United Provinces received, by the so-called Barrier Treaty, the right to garrison several fortresses in the now Austrian Netherlands. But this was all that they gained from their almost excessive struggles for the common cause. Since the time of the origin of the state of the United Netherlands by the Treaty of Utrecht, until the Peace of Utrecht 134 years had expired, and of these 30 were years of peace, but 104 years of war. These years were, moreover, perturbed by continuous internal quarrels, by wars in East India, and by the services given to other states. These had required an outlay of forces which seemed to be wholly out of proportion to the size of the state. In the year 1672, the united Anglo-French navy which set out against the states consisted of 101 large warships. These were armed with more than 6,000 guns, and manned by 35,000 men. The states opposed them with 91 warships, together with 65 fireships and pinnaces, and they won the battle. These were the greatest navies which have ever before or since been seen on the sea. Each of them surpassed in size the celebrated Armada of Philip II. In the year 1673, the Netherlands equipped 75 warships, 43 smaller ships, with 4,300 cannon and 20,000 men, and when William III reorganised the army, they put 66,000 men in the field. This turbulent and active period in the history of the Netherlands is at once that of their greatest splendour and their florescence. The very debts of the government, and these were the only vestiges traceable in the country, of so many wars were profitable for individuals. The abundance of currency was so great, and the credit of the government so little impaired, that it could obtain at any moment in the country vast sums at a small interest. Gold was so abundant that they did not desire to pay up the state debts. Such wealth and the gigantic achievements and vigorous efforts of the states had procured for them a position and an influence in the political world which little accorded with the marked disregard which the other powers, and especially France, took care to treat the merchant state. And if they charged it to the states as an insult that the latter claimed on one of their medals, to have aided kings, protected and reconciled them, to have maintained the freedom of the seas, and to have restored the peace of Europe, then the only occasion for it was, very truly, that so small a power had dared to tell the truth. But the political greatness of Holland was an exalted position, one which could not last. The peace which elevated the other states produced the overthrow of this one. William III, who reigned in England under many limitations, enjoyed in the Netherlands the most marked respect, so that the French did not without reason call him the King of the Netherlands and the Stadtholder of England, but with him ceased the male issue of the Nassau-Orange House, and the parties used this circumstance to remove the rest of the members of the Orange House from high positions, and to re-establish a government without a stadtholder. The result of this was the total ruin of the army. It is true that the War of Spanish Succession, that most successful of all Netherland campaigns, happened after the death of the stadtholder, but it was conducted with the army and all the arrangements which he had called into being. How bad the condition of the military in the Netherlands became is demonstrated by the ease with which the French in the new war of the year 1747 took possession of their barrier towns. In this year 35,000 men belonging to the troops of the state were French prisoners, that is, nearly their whole army. Business also declined, and the principal reason for this was that other nations were now carrying on a commerce with the East Indies. Their shops and manufactories stopped, and the Hollanders thus had to withstand enormous competition. It further happened that while the States, in order to render France's dangerous proximity less menacing, had bound themselves closely to England, England itself, a no less dangerous nation on the sea, had increased its own maritime power by the ruin of that of France to such an extent that soon the navy of the Netherlands was no longer a match for it. Thus, after a long period of peace, the United Provinces had considerably fallen from their ascendancy, and they offer little that interests our observation. Excepting the internal conflict between the Orange and anti-Orange parties, the origin of this opposition coincides with that of the state, and its continuance during the whole duration of the same manifests itself at times in open combat, at times in secret intrigue. At the death of William III, who died without issue, all influence of the House of Orange was again lost, but the French invasion about the middle of the 18th century brought William IV again to the helm of the state by the vote of the people. The great likeness of the destiny of this stadtholder with that of his royal predecessor William III has been generally noted. The one, like the other, was born after the death of his father, and with an unusually tender and weakly constitution. During their minority they lost all rights which their forefathers had possessed. Both married daughters of English kings, and in consequence of unsuccessful wars threatening the state with destruction, as well as of popular uprisings which broke out both times in Vere, both were elevated to the same dignity in the United States, which position was henceforth declared to be hereditary in the male and female line. Still, the opposition party was not destroyed. Under William V it lifted its head with new power, especially in the last quarter of the last century, and it really continued to be in possession of the greatest part of the actual power in the state. Holland and its powerful, wealthy, and arrogant Amsterdam were the chief supports of this faction, which applied to itself the name of the Patriots, so as to show by this that their opponents, the Orange Party, are not patriots, but the opposite. The most open acts of injustice and persecution were permitted against this party. The hereditary stadtholder was attacked in the most dishonourable manner, insulted, and overwhelmed with calumnious writings. Indeed, it went so far as to take from him the command over the troops in The Hague, and this prince could not defend himself from such unlawful attacks and insults without arousing a civil war. Incited by the aid of foreign powers, and fearful lest the party favouring the prince in the States Assembly could yet win the upper hand, the patriots of Amsterdam in April 1787 determined upon measures of violence. They changed the council in the said city, in Rotterdam and Utrecht, and ordered their troops to march to the aid of their supporters in those cities. At this moment the Prince of Orange came out with a final declaration, which encouraged his supporters to appear publicly, and then it became very manifest that the greater part of the nation was for the stadtholder. End of section 7.